Hello, everyone. This is William Butcher and Andre Romero-Carey, and we have this video presentation set up for you. I will let Andre take it away.
All right, so I'll be telling you about a man named Rainier Maria Rilke. Um, he was a strange man. I'll just say that. So, his life. He was born in Prague in 1875, and his mother was very fond of dressing him up as a girl. She even put long hair on him, the dresses, the whole kit and caboodle. And the reason she did this is actually kind of sad because she had lost a previous child who was a girl quite young. And so she basically used good old Rainier as a replacement for the daughter she lost. Um, and she dressed him up like this till he was about 6. And then his parents sent him off to military school. He didn't fare too well there. Rainier was a delicate soul, and so a hard military camp was not his place of belonging. And then he also tried to become a proper academic, but that also failed because he liked to move around and generally was not very good at doing what he was told or staying to any sort of schedule or anything like that. So he did not succeed in academia. And then throughout his life, he lived in a lot of different places. He lived in the castle of an old German royal for a long time, and then also just like tiny apartments. He traveled constantly, and he like completely avoided long-term responsibilities. And then in 1926, he died from leukemia, which was possibly hastened by pricking his finger on a rose, and that's actually not a joke. Um, yeah, so, his career was defined by constant wandering and travel. Like I said previously, he spent years and years traveling funded by wealthy patrons. Um, he took a job with this sculptor, Augustin Rodin, but he got fired because he has a terrible work ethic and would only work when he was like feeling like it. And good old Rodin did not like that. And then he was sort of inspired by Russian mysticism and actually had a relationship with Leo Tolstoy. So it's kind of interesting. Um, and then he moved into this castle where he wrote the Dunio Eliges, which was dramatic, kind of a dramatic move, but it turns out the castle was like a perfect writing environment for him because it was super isolated. And he also wrote a novel called the Notebooks of Malt Laurid Brig, which was so intense that he rarely talked about it. Like the process of writing was so intense for him, he didn't want to talk about it. So here's his major works: the Book of Horace. This was spiritual poetry. It was sort of weird, which is why I said it's for insomniacs because it has some very strange thoughts. There's the Dunio Eliges, which was written in the castle, and supposedly for this one, he was having some serious writer's block. So before he would write, he would pace back and forth in the castle for like days, and then finally he sat down to write. Then there's the Sonnets to Orpheus, which was inspired by a dead girl and a love of Greek mythology. There's Letters to a Young Poet. He basically accidentally created this one. It was a reflection on his own life, and I don't believe it was meant to be published, but nonetheless, it was. And then there was the Notebooks of Maltelori Brig, which was a novel basically capturing an existential crisis. Here's his themes. He talked about love, but he did not have a loving way of talking about love. He thought it was painful, complicated, and temporary. Death, he thought about death a lot. Um, this harkens back to his death. Supposedly, when he was offered painkillers for his leukemia, he refused because, quote unquote, he wanted to experience death properly. So he was a little bit of a weird guy. And then he liked to talk about how change happens, and it was one of the central topics that he wrote the most beautifully about. And then he also believed that poetry was a way to change people and influence them, sort of going back to his themes of transformation. And then, of course, he really liked solitude. He didn't really like people. He wasn't a people guy, sort of a moody artist type character. So then here's his influences. Like I said, Russian mysticism. He also liked German philosophy and French art. And then the sculptor Auguste Rodin, Rilke kind of idolized him, and Rodin was not very impressed with Rilke, so it led to sort of a weird thing where Rilke was constantly chasing Rodin, and Rodin was like, get out of my life. I don't really like you. Another one was Louis André Salom, who was a psychoanalyst writer and was good old Rainier's longtime intellectual crush. She was also like 20 years older than him. So it was a little bit strange, and he would write her like super sappy love letters. It was a little strange. Um, and then he was shaped by his wealthy patrons that were basically the only thing that kept him from total financial ruin. And of course, he's a very influential poet today. A lot of modern poets base some of their works off of his ideas. And so now I'm going to do a recitation of Go to the Limits of Your Longing. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You sent out, you sent out beyond your call. Go to the limits of your longing. Embody me. Flare up like a flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. Okay, discussion time. Wow, good discussion, guys. I'm proud of you. All right, so before we conclude, I just want to tell you about some ridiculous things that this guy got up to. So, first of all, he had a total existential breakdown about an omelet. So, he tried to cook an omelet with what he called total artistic devotion. But given his lack of practical anything, he completely ruined the omelet. And then this like ruined him for weeks. He couldn't like do anything because he was so ruined by how badly he messed up making this perfect omelet. It was bad for him. He was also he claimed that he couldn't have pets because he was worried that he would get lost in the emotional depth of their eyes and he wouldn't be able to think about anything else. As I talked about previously, he couldn't write unless he was in essentially total isolation. He always struggled with money, and he loved to answer fan letters and give like super super deep emotional advice to people he'd never met. He was also terrible at practical tasks, claiming that he wasn't built for simple chores, which kind of explains the omelet incident. And he also, we talked before, avoided stability like the plague. He would leave his home for something like the air had changed. That's how much he didn't like to stay in one place. So, some more absurd antics. He was asked by a Swedish nobleman to write a children's book for his daughter, and instead he ended up composing this book, The Tale of the Love of the Death of the Coronet of Christopher Rilke, which was like super sad and way too tragic for kids, but it actually turned out to be a bestseller among adults. Um, and basically, what happened is like he saw a dollhouse, and then he got inspired, and he was like thinking, oh, everything in the world is just like this whole. It's just a bad copy of everything else. Um, and that led him down this whole rabbit hole to write this book, and yeah, big rabbit hole. Um, and then, as I mentioned previously, he liked to write letters to or respond to fans. But it became too much for him. And so instead of just responding to fewer letters, he just kind of lost his mind and left his house and then didn't come back because there were just too many letters. Um, and then another thing he didn't really edit his poems because he had this belief that like the first draft had some deep mystical source and that tampering with it would be like messing with the divine essence of the poem and it would be like blasphemy. So his first drafts were essentially sacred texts, which is, kind of awesome given how good awesome his poems are. But at the same time, like he was super stressed about writing a really good poem the first time. And then this kind of leads nicely into the last thing, which is that when he was writing the Dunio elegies, he was like, he had some trouble with his perfectionism. And so instead of writing, he would just like sit down and stare at the pages, or he would pace around dramatically in the castle he was living in at the time, essentially waiting for a moment of inspiration to strike him. Um, and eventually, the poems, he says, came to him in a vision. Um, but it's probably just a more mystical way of saying that he procrastinated until the pressure got to him and he finally broke down and actually wrote them. So, all right. So, what did we learn from good old Rainier? Well, he was kind of a goofy fella. a bit of a weird character, if I may say so. But he was also a brilliant philosophical wanderer and a professional melancholic. He wrote beautiful poetry that I hope still resonates with you guys today. I suppose that'll depend on how well the discussion went. Um, and he managed to make profound loneliness and ideas of change into incredibly beautiful and poetic ideas that I mean, I think they really resonate with me. So, and he left behind works that continue to inspire artists and thinkers and deep souls everywhere to this very day. So, I think he did something pretty impressive and was an excellent poet.
Thank you, Andre, for your presentation. So now I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about Charles Bukowski. He was kind of the inverse poet of Rainer. So as you'll see, he was born in 1920 and died in 1994. He was a German American, which at the time was known as Prussia. Some of his hobbies include horse racing, women, and alcohol. He was kind of the common man, everyday poet. So he would talk about like the struggles of being in poverty, the struggles of paying rent, the struggles of spilling coffee on yourself. Interestingly, he actually started poetry at 35 years old. Before this, he was only like strictly a novelist. His poems are very free verse. They're conversational. They do have a lot of techniques and a very wide range of techniques that he uses that I will talk later about. Um, and over his time, he's kind of matured, I'd say. His earlier poems were a lot more edgy and kind of like emo to a certain extent. But I think that mellowed out over the years, and even he agrees that his older poems were the better ones. He took a lot of inspiration to other similar poets and writers, but one of his most like stated ones is E. E. Cummings, and you can see this in his style. And also interestingly, he was a big like classical music fan as well. So he read like classical books like Chaucer and whatnot, but he would also just listen to Bach and Beethoven and a bunch of different classical composers. And for those of you who've watched BoJack Horseman, he kind of reminds me of BoJack Horseman, to where Charles Bukowski was not a great guy, especially towards women, and like he did like admit to his faults, but he also never really attempted to change his faults. So take that how you will. So I will be reciting the Bluebird, which is probably his most infamous poem. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke, and the whores and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? Do you want to screw up the works? You want to blow my book sales in Europe? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night sometimes when everybody's asleep. I say, I know you're in there, so don't be sad. Then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die. And we sleep together like that, with our secret pact. And it's nice enough to make a man weep. But I don't weep. Do you? Okay, discussion time. What an awesome discussion. So I'm also gonna do a small analysis of a few other poems and excerpts by Charles Bukowski, just to show some similarities in his free verse and some of his techniques used that we saw in Bluebird and some that we didn't see in Bluebird. So keep in mind, these are just a few examples. Sometimes he uses them, sometimes he doesn't. He has over like 1,000 poems, so there's a wide range. But these two are is poetry and excerpts from Flophouse. And as you can see, this is like exemplifying the minimalistic and simplistic approach that he is like somewhat known for. As you can see, there's like uh, this is all like one or two sentences, and it's very spaced out. And you also have a lot of enjambment taking place in this. Next up, I have a few excerpts from Dinosauria, We. And this is specifically to point out repetition, but also this is to point out certain themes that Charles Bukowski typically touches on. If you would like to read these, you can see there's a lot on political and economic stances that actually still kind of apply to this day, if not even more than back then. So you can see how not only how his writing style has stayed relevant, but also the themes and the ideas that he's wrote about are still highly relevant to the modern day. And then lastly, there's this poem of his called "We Ain't Got No Money, Honey, But We Got Rain." Uh, it's probably like, in my opinion, of all the poems I read, his magnum opus. But it's also like 5 pages, so I could not recite it in time. It has like roughly everything you could think of from Charles Bukowski, from abuse to women to childhood trauma to economics. So, but this is also a pretty good example of all the different like ideas and techniques used. And here I picked up two different excerpts to show techniques that weren't used in Bluebird, but sometimes he'll do. You can see like one his descriptive technique. At times, I'd say it's really pretty, especially like how he can describe the rain as thick, mean, and steady in all caps. It really gives like a certain idea in your head. Um, and then along with that, like you have some fun onomatopoeia with like drip, drip, drip as it diagonally, the lines are diagonal, which I think is just kind of fun. And then you have, of course, Bang, Pang, Pang. So I think this is just a really interesting poem of his. I would highly recommend reading it. I could make the whole presentation about this poem, but I would just want to show a few different excerpts to show how he is really a man of all talents. Like they said, whenever whenever he had any free time, he was always either drinking, betting on horse races, or writing. So about 1/3 of his life was spent on writing. You could estimate. So, and then lastly, this is like the Bukowski effect, I'd like to call it. This is kind of like what he's left, what his legacy is known for, and I'd say what he's influenced other writers and poets. So he has this emphasis on gritty realism. I only slightly touched on it, but there's a lot of poems out there that are a lot more dark and heavy. Specifically, some of his earlier works too. Along with that, he's very conversational and freeform, as was the time, but also this is like very deep and personal, and a lot of it's also just his daily life, like a literal conversation about like, oh, I don't want to wake up and write. I love being a poet because I can sleep into 11 and I don't have to write. Or him talking about how he hates rent, or how he waits for ants to build up in his sink just so he can turn on the faucet and watch them all drown. Um, Along with that, confessional writing. Something that is kind of cool at the time that I noticed was that like he talks a lot about his emotions, and even if he like attempts to be somewhat of this like macho manly man at times, he also like you can see a lot of his inner thoughts, and you can see like as you're reading his poems, his personal like up and downs. Sometimes he's really sweet and caring. Sometimes he's really not. So you can just see that change in personality uh, while reading his poems. And then lastly, probably most infamously, is how he just like hates literary elitism. He's very much for like the common man. He's not meant to like be. He doesn't want to be something that's like snobbish or posh. He wants to be like talking to your average Joe at McDonald's and whatnot. And I think that's really inspirational and cool because it's meant to be poetry for everyone, and I think he does a really good job at that. So, lastly, we'll leave you with this quote. Thank you so much for listening to our short video presentation, and thank you all for your feedback and your discussion.